It was a sound the Germans would never forget, a faint whoosh in the night sky, like the soft flap of wings. Soldiers looked up, hearts pounding, scanning the darkness. No engines, no warning, just the eerie whisper of death approaching. Moments later, explosions ripped through their camps. The attackers vanished into the blackness as quickly as they came. Terrified, the Germans gave them a name born from fear, the Night Witches. These were not men. They were young Soviet women, barely out of their teens, flying flimsy biplanes made of wood and canvas. Their aircraft were so slow that they were almost invisible to radar. But their courage burned brighter than the searchlights that tried to catch them. They would fly as many as 8 missions in a single night, braving bullets, freezing winds, and exhaustion, determined to make the enemy pay. In 1941, when Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union, the nation was on the brink of collapse. Entire cities were falling, soldiers retreating, and morale was bleeding out. But in that darkness, one woman saw a light, Marina Raskova, a celebrated Soviet aviator and a symbol of defiance. She convinced Stalin himself to form 3 all-female air regiments, giving Soviet women a chance to fight for their homeland, not just nurse it. Among them, one unit would go down in history, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Made up of teachers, students, and daughters who had never seen battle, they would become the most feared squadron on the Eastern Front. The Germans laughed at first. Then they stopped laughing. Each mission was madness. Their wooden planes, old Polikarpov Po-2s, were slow, open cockpit relics. The women flew without parachutes to carry more bombs. They had no radar, no radio, and barely enough fuel. Yet, night after night, they flew straight into enemy fire. To avoid detection, they would cut their engines near the target and glide silently toward the ground. The sound of the wind rushing through the wings was like a witch's broom slicing the air, hence the name. And when their bombs fell, the earth itself seemed to scream. By dawn, they were back at base, exhausted, frostbitten, but unbroken. They patched bullet holes with rags, loaded new bombs, and took off again. Their hands were numb, their faces covered in soot. But in their hearts, there was only fire, vengeance for every village burned, every child lost, every comrade killed. That whisper in the night would soon echo across the front lines. The legend of the Night Witches had begun. Most of the women in the 588th were barely 20 years old. Some had never even driven a car before joining the regiment. They came from schools, farms, and factories, answering Stalin's call to arms. They were driven by anger, love for their homeland, and a burning need to prove themselves in a man's war. Training was brutal. At Engels Air Base, near the Volga River, they learned to fly, navigate, and drop bombs with precision. They practiced in freezing winds, sleeping little, eating less. Their uniforms were hand-me-downs from male pilots, their boots too big, their gloves torn. They cut off their hair, smeared soot on their faces, and learned to fly by instinct, not instruments. The instructors didn't believe in them. Male officers mocked them, calling them little girls playing war. But as the weeks turned into months, the laughter faded. These women learned to fly their fragile planes like extensions of their own bodies. They could feel the wind shift through the fabric wings, sense danger before seeing it. When their training ended, the regiment was sent to the front lines. They flew in groups of 3. 2 would distract German searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, while the 3rd swooped in silently to release her bombs. It was teamwork built on trust and sheer nerve. Each sortie was a dance with death. The planes could be brought down by a single bullet. If hit, they had little chance of survival. The wooden frames burned fast, but retreat was not in their vocabulary. "We came here to fight," one pilot said. "If we die as soldiers." Even their equipment was outdated. They navigated using stopwatches and maps illuminated by pencil flashlights. The slightest error could send them crashing into the dark forests below. Yet somehow, mission after mission, they found their targets, rail lines, ammunition dumps, enemy camps, and hit them with uncanny precision. As winter fell, the women became ghosts of the sky. The Germans learned to fear the quiet. Every rustle of wind could mean the night witches were near. Soldiers began shooting at shadows, terrified of what they could not see. And in that terror, these young women found their power. The heart of the night witches was their creator, Marina Raskova. Before the war, she was the Soviet Union's answer to Amelia Earhart. Beautiful, brave, and brilliant. She had set long-distance flight records, appeared on Soviet propaganda posters, and inspired millions of young women. But when Hitler's invasion began, her fame turned to fury. Raskova used her influence to persuade Stalin to let women fly combat missions. If the men cannot stop the Germans, she argued, then let the women try. Stalin agreed, partly out of desperation, partly out of curiosity. On October 8, 1941, the order was signed. 3 women's air regiments were born, and Raskova herself took command of recruiting and training them. She was a strict leader, pushing her recruits beyond their limits. But she also understood their fears. Many had never left home before. Now they were preparing to fly into death itself. Raskova told them, "You will be fighting not only the Germans, but the disbelief of your own people." When the 588th Regiment finally reached the front, Raskova personally led them to their first base, near the Caucasus Mountains. The journey was brutal. They flew through snowstorms, landing on makeshift airstrips. Tragically, Raskova herself would not survive the war. Her plane crashed in 1943 while attempting to join the front. The women buried her with full military honors. The first female pilot to receive such recognition in the Soviet Union. Her death only strengthened their resolve. "We fly for her now," one navigator said. "Every bomb we drop is for Marina." Under her shadow, the Night Witches became a symbol of Soviet resistance. They weren't fighting for medals or fame. They were fighting for survival, for their mothers, for their homeland. And with every mission, they wrote their story in fire across the night sky. By 1943, the Germans had begun to dread them more than any other Soviet unit. Their raids disrupted supply lines, destroyed fuel depots, and shattered morale. No matter how hard the Germans tried, they could never shoot them all down. The witches always came back, and the whispering sound that haunted the dark skies of the Eastern Front grew louder, night after night. By the summer of 1943, the Night Witches had become a legend whispered among soldiers on both sides of the front. Their mission that June was one of their most dangerous yet, to destroy a heavily guarded German supply bridge near the Don River. The bridge was vital for enemy reinforcements, and its destruction could cripple an entire sector of the front. But the defenses were fierce. Spotlights, machine guns, and anti-aircraft cannons lined the riverbanks. The women gathered in a small smoky tent before takeoff. Maps spread across a rickety table, cigarette smoke curling through the air. Their commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, looked over her crew, faces hardened by months of war, eyes tired but determined. "They won't expect us twice," she said quietly. "So we go twice." That night they flew in total darkness. The moon hid behind thick clouds, perfect cover. The first wave dropped their bombs and pulled away, drawing the Germans' fire. Searchlights sliced through the sky like white swords. Then came the second wave, gliding silently with engines cut. They released their bombs from barely 100 meters above the bridge. The explosions shattered the calm of the night. Flames shot up into the darkness as the bridge collapsed into the river below. Machine guns roared from the ground, bullets ripping through the air. One plane caught fire mid-flight. The pilot, Irina Sabrova, stayed at the controls long enough to steer away from her comrades before her aircraft plunged into the forest. She never came back. The others returned to base in silence, their faces streaked with soot and tears. When dawn came, a Soviet scout plane confirmed it. The bridge was gone. The German advance had halted. The cost had been high, but the mission was a success. The women buried Irina that morning with a single vow carved into the frozen ground. "We will not stop until victory." That night, when the Germans rebuilt their camp, the faint hum returned once again. The witches were back. By 1944, the German soldiers on the Eastern Front had a new superstition. They claimed that if you heard the whispering of broomsticks in the night, death would soon follow. The night witches, they said, were not human. They were demons who flew with the wind. In truth, the terror they inspired was not born of sorcery, but skill. The 588th Regiment had perfected their tactics. Flying low, they weaved between trees and hills to avoid radar. When near their targets, they cut their engines, gliding silently through the black sky. The only sound was the soft whoosh of wind over the wings. Then came the bombs. Small, deadly, precise. The Germans tried everything to stop them. They stationed more anti-aircraft guns, increased night patrols, even offered the Iron Cross to any pilot who could shoot down a night witch. But it was nearly impossible. The Po-2 flew too low and too slow for advanced German fighters to lock on. The Luftwaffe pilots called it fighting a ghost. Each time the witches struck, German camps descended into chaos. Soldiers fired blindly into the darkness. Horses bolted. Ammunition stores went up in flames. Even when they hit nothing, the psychological toll was immense. The fear of them, one captured soldier admitted, was worse than the bombs. Inside the regiment, however, the women fought their own fears. The exhaustion was crushing. Each mission meant flying through tracer fire, braving blizzards, and returning with frostbite and empty stomachs. They lost friends, often within sight of base. Yet they never complained. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, once returned from a mission with her plane riddled with bullet holes and her map frozen to her leg. When asked how she survived, she smiled faintly. "We didn't have time to be afraid." The Germans never truly understood that the power of the night witches was not in their planes, it was in their will. Inside the 588th Regiment, a bond stronger than steel grew between the women. They were sisters in every sense, bound by hardship, loss, and love for their comrades. In their cramped barracks, laughter often echoed louder than the sound of war outside. They sang old folk songs before missions, braided each other's hair, and shared letters from home. It was their way of staying human in an inhuman world. When one of them didn't return from a mission, the pain was unbearable. They would gather around her empty bunk in silence, her flying cap placed where her head should have been. No speeches, no tears, just the sound of engines warming up for the next flight. Duty didn't allow for mourning. "If we cried for everyone we lost," one said softly, "we'd drown before the war ended." Yet within that silence was strength. Every loss hardened their resolve. They learned to fix their planes themselves, to sew uniforms, and to share whatever rations they had. Their resilience was a quiet rebellion against despair. There were moments of tenderness, too, fleeting reminders of life beyond the war. They wrote poems in their flight logs, traded keepsakes, and sometimes in the early dawn watched the sunrise together after surviving another night. The sky that had been their battleground also became their sanctuary. Many of them would later say that it wasn't the medals or the victories they remembered most, but the faces of those who never returned. The laughter, the songs, the whispered goodbyes before takeoff. In a war that tried to strip humanity away, the night witches found a way to keep theirs alive, in each other. The winter of 1944 was brutal, even by Soviet standards. The air froze breath itself, and the snow swallowed entire villages. Yet, for the night witches, the war only grew more relentless. The Eastern Front was pushing west, and every inch of land reclaimed from the Germans came with blood and frost. Their mission that season was to cripple German fuel convoys retreating through Belarus, and it would become one of the deadliest operations they ever flew. Each night, the women loaded their fragile biplanes with makeshift bombs, sometimes constructed from stolen artillery shells or old fuel canisters. They were short on everything: food, fuel, and even spare parts. The ground crews scavenged wreckage from previous missions to keep the fleet flying. "We flew," one pilot recalled, "because there was no other choice. If we didn't, someone else would die. Flying through the snow was like flying through a grave." Visibility dropped to near zero. The freezing wind bit through their thin flight suits, and frost formed on their goggles. Yet they pressed on, following the dim glow of fires from the previous night's raids as their only navigation. They approached the convoy from the east, cutting their engines and gliding low. The bombs fell in silence, then erupted into pillars of flame. Fuel trucks ignited, turning the forest into an inferno. German soldiers fired into the sky, but the witches vanished as quickly as they came. The convoy was obliterated. Hundreds of vehicles destroyed. It was one of the few times their work was immediately visible from the ground. The men below cheered as the horizon burned red. That night, when the pilots landed back at base, their faces were blackened with soot, their hair stiff with ice. Yet, in their exhaustion, there was triumph. They had turned the darkness into a weapon, and for the first time, the war was moving in their favor. As the Red Army advanced westward, the Germans began to collapse under the weight of their own defeat. But even cornered, they fought viciously. In February 1945, the Night Witches received intelligence of a major German headquarters concealed in the woods near Gdansk. It was heavily fortified. Anti-aircraft guns, spotlights, and a ring of soldiers protected it. The mission was suicidal, but it was also crucial. The enemy command there was coordinating counterattacks against Soviet positions. Commander Bershanskaya gathered her squadron in the freezing dawn. "They think we won't dare," she said, "so we will." The women exchanged silent glances. There were no volunteers, only the willing. That night, they flew in pairs, one plane distracting the defenses while the other struck. The first wave was met with blinding flares and tracers slicing through the darkness. One of the planes exploded mid-air, lighting the forest below. But the others pressed on. Using the chaos, they cut their engines and glided straight into the heart of the storm. Their bombs hit precisely. The headquarters erupted in flames, maps, equipment, and officers gone in seconds. The cost was devastating. Of the 12 aircraft that took off, only 7 returned. The survivors landed with empty fuel tanks and bullet-riddled wings. They climbed out silently, the weight of the mission etched into their faces. One woman, her hands still trembling, whispered, "We did it. But at what price?" The operation crippled German coordination in the region, paving the way for a Soviet breakthrough days later. Yet the victory felt hollow. For every success came a loss that cut deeper than before. Still, when morning came and the order for the next mission arrived, the women mounted their planes again. They had long accepted that in war, survival was not guaranteed. Only the fight was. In May 1945, as the echoes of war finally began to fade across Europe, the Night Witches flew their last combat missions over the dying embers of the German front. The radio crackled with news from Berlin. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. The women of the 588th sat in stunned silence. They had dreamed of this moment for years, yet when it came, it felt unreal. Too quiet, too sudden. For the first time, the night sky was still. No searchlights, no tracers, no engines cutting through the dark, just wind. The women stood beside their battered Po-2s, many patched and scarred from countless missions. Some planes bore the names of fallen comrades painted in white across their fuselages, quiet memorials in fading letters. Their commander gathered them for one final briefing, but there were no targets this time, only gratitude. She looked at her pilots, the girls who had arrived as teenagers and grown into warriors. "You fought," she said, her voice breaking. "You endured. And you made history." In total, the Night Witches flew over 30,000 missions. They dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs. 30 of them were killed in action, but hundreds survived to see peace, though not all were recognized. When the war ended, most were quietly demobilized, sent home with few medals and fewer words. Some returned to teaching, others to nursing or farming. Their bravery was not forgotten by those who served beside them, but official honors came slowly, and often too late. Still, they never sought glory. When asked years later how they wanted to be remembered, one pilot simply said, "We flew because our country needed us. That was enough." The wind carried their legacy long after their planes stopped flying, a whisper in the dark sky where witches once ruled the night. When the war ended, the Night Witches expected recognition, After all, they had done the impossible, flown outdated wooden biplanes into the most dangerous skies in Europe and survived. They had terrorized the German war machine and proven that courage had no gender. But instead of parades or medals, many of them were quietly dismissed. The Soviet Union, rebuilding from ashes, had little patience for celebrating female heroes. The military needed men again, to reconstruct, to lead, to symbolize strength. The women were told their duty was over and were sent home with meager pay and vague thanks. Some were reassigned to clerical posts. Others, stripped of rank, returned to civilian life as if the war had been just a dream. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most decorated of them all, remembered that silence vividly. "We came home," she said, "and no one asked. No one cared what we had done. We had flown through hell, and now we stood in bread lines." Her words captured the heartbreak of so many forgotten veterans, brave souls erased by the very nation they had saved. Still, among themselves, they kept the memories alive. Letters passed quietly between former comrades, sharing news of births, marriages, and deaths. Once a year, some met at a small airfield outside Moscow, where they would stand in a circle, raise their glasses, and remember the sound of engines cutting through the night. History had chosen to forget them, but they remembered each other. Decades later, as Soviet archives began to open, historians stumbled upon the flight logs of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. At first, the numbers seemed impossible. 30,000 missions, 23,000 tons of bombs, all by women flying planes held together by fabric and faith. But, as the records were verified, the truth came to light. The Night Witches were real, and their achievements were unmatched. By then, many of the original pilots were elderly, living modestly in small towns or collective farms. Some had never even told their children what they had done. When journalists came to interview them, they laughed softly at the attention. "We did our duty," one woman said. "That is all." The rediscovery of their story coincided with a new generation's hunger to understand women's roles in the war, not as nurses or helpers, but as warriors. The Night Witches became symbols of defiance, not only against the Nazis, but against the limits that society had placed on women. Museums began to display their uniforms. Films were made, books written. Their patched-up Po-2 planes, once dismissed as relics, were restored and shown with reverence. The sound of their slow, whispering engines, once a warning of death, became a song of remembrance. Their legacy was not just about warfare. It was about possibility, proof that courage is not confined to strength, but to spirit. By the time the world fully recognized the Night Witches, most of them were gone. Those who remained were frail but proud, their medals polished, their eyes still bright with the fire of youth. In one of her last interviews, Nadezhda Popova was asked what it felt like to be a legend. She smiled faintly and said, "We were just girls who refused to be afraid." Their story inspired not just historians, but generations of women who saw in them a reflection of their own struggles. The fight to be seen, to be respected, to be remembered. Across Russia, memorials were built. In Germany, where once they had been feared, museums displayed exhibits in their honor. The sound of their planes, recreated in documentaries, carried the same haunting rhythm, a reminder that even in darkness, bravery can have wings. But perhaps their greatest monument was invisible, the courage they had ignited in others. For every young woman who dared to dream, who refused to stay silent, the Night Witches flew again in spirit, and as time moved on, their story became something larger than war, a parable of resilience, unity, and defiance. When the wind howls over the old Eastern Front, it's said you can still hear the faint hum of engines, ghostly wings slicing through the cold night sky, not of monsters or myths, but of women who turned darkness into victory. The Night Witches, the sisters of the storm, who taught the world that the sky belongs to the brave. The Night Witches were more than a regiment. They were a sisterhood forged in fire. Most of them were barely out of their teens when they joined the Soviet Air Force, driven by a mix of patriotism and defiance. The world had told them that war was not for women, that courage had a gender, and that fear was their rightful place. But they refused to believe it. In the barracks they shared everything: uniforms, laughter, tears, even the single pair of boots that had to be passed between two pilots. They wrote notes to each other before every mission, promising to meet again at dawn. Sometimes those notes were never read. Yet even in loss they found strength in one another. "We were all afraid," one of them recalled, "but none of us would ever show it. We couldn't let the others see us break." Their friendship became their armor. When a plane failed to return, the others would fly the next night anyway, through grief and exhaustion, because that was what their fallen sisters would have wanted. Each mission was a vow, to keep flying until the sky itself surrendered. That unity was their secret weapon. It wasn't their planes or their tactics that made them terrifying. It was their unbreakable bond, a kind of shared heartbeat that pulsed through every flight, every raid, every whispering descent upon the enemy. Long after the war, that bond endured. They gathered at reunions, gray-haired and soft-spoken, holding hands as if afraid that letting go would make them vanish again into history's shadows. War leaves no one untouched, and for the Night Witches, victory came with scars. Many carried the weight of what they had seen: the burning cities below, the comrades who never came back, the guilt of survival. They were celebrated as heroes in rare moments, but when the applause faded, they returned to ordinary lives haunted by extraordinary memories. Some tried to forget, burying the war deep inside. Others became teachers, engineers, or mothers, channeling the same determination that had once kept them alive. But in quiet moments, they still felt the pull of the night sky, the rush of cold air on their faces, the trembling hum of the Po-2's fragile wings. For some, it was impossible to adjust. The freedom of the cockpit had given them purpose, a rare independence in a world that soon demanded obedience again. To go back to kitchens and factories after commanding the skies felt like a silent punishment. It was easier, one woman said, to face the Germans than to return to being invisible. Yet even in the silence that followed the war, they carried themselves with quiet pride. Their lives became testaments to resilience, to the idea that true strength often hides behind gentleness. The war had changed them. Yes, but it had also revealed them, to themselves and to history. In the decades that followed, the story of the Night Witches spread beyond Russia, reaching hearts around the world. Young girls in classrooms read about them and felt something awaken. The realization that bravery could wear any face, any voice. Artists painted their likenesses, filmmakers told their tales, and historians wrote their names into the pages of time where they always belonged. They became symbols not just of war, but of womanhood itself, fierce, enduring, unyielding. And though many of their names were lost, the spirit they carried survived. It lived on in every pilot who looked at the stars and dreamed, in every woman who defied a limit, in every soul who refused to surrender to fear. At memorials in Russia, visitors still place flowers beneath their photographs, bouquets of red and white roses that speak of both sacrifice and victory. Their planes, restored and preserved, now rest in museums, silent but alive in memory. And on some quiet nights, when the wind moves across the fields where they once flew, locals swear they can still hear the faint whoosh of fabric wings gliding through the darkness. That sound, the soft whisper of death and defiance, has become eternal, because the Night Witches were never truly gone. They are the wind that never stops moving, the courage that never fades, the whisper in the dark that says, "We are still flying."